I have to start, and this is where we're starting today. I have to drop back just for a moment and start with understanding why we are broken, because we have certain weaknesses. And even though that we may have weaknesses, how do we deal with those weaknesses? So today I want to deal with what is the purpose of my weakness. We may have different weaknesses. Not everybody has a weakness in the sexual arena, but there are different weaknesses that we have. But we need to understand the purpose of our weakness. And Paul gives us a classic or an example here of his weakness. And then he tells us how he dealt with that weakness. So this is what we're going to deal with, a weakness, how we deal with it, the purpose of this weakness. And we're going to use Paul, what he's written here, as our backdrop to be able to understand it. Now, we're going to start with, let me tell you about going to an interview. A lot of times we have to go to interviews. And whenever you have been to an interview, all of you probably have been to an interview at some time or some point in your life, they come with a question. They would ask you is, what is your greatest weakness? Now, if you don't answer it, then you'll appear to be arrogant. And if you come clean and tell them your greatest weakness, they might not hire you. So you have to be careful in how you give your response. Now, they say there are several ways in which you can respond to this question of what is my greatest weakness. And one of them is that you can take a weakness and disguise it as a strength. For example, you can say I'm extremely self-motivated. And because I'm self-motivated, I tend to take on more than is asked of me. So you take a weakness, pride, strength. And so then you can also minimize the weakness. So you can come back and you can say, well, you know what? I don't have a great deal of patience, but I've learned to be patient over time. And it's allowed me to be more, be able to handle people better. You minimize the weakness. Then you can also turn and you can say, you know, there's a weakness that doesn't even have to do with the job. You can turn and say, you know, here's my greatest weakness. My greatest weakness has to do with public speaking. Has nothing to do with you being an engineer or accountant, you see. So you give them a weakness that has nothing to do or pertaining to the job in which you apply. See, because in our culture, we celebrate successes. We celebrate strength. That's what we celebrate. And then when we get here to Paul, Paul is doing exactly the opposite. He is celebrating his weakness. So then Paul turns and he challenges us with our weaknesses. He wants to then challenge us with those weaknesses and say, okay, you have to lose your strength. Your personal strength and your successes in order for the weakness then to be manifest. And he's saying when you do that, actually strength comes out and it drives you into a greater strength and power that you have never tapped into before. So your weakness actually then pushes you into a new level with God, drives you deeper into his plan. So he said, what if your weakness then, what if your weakness is God at work in you, actually trying to make you strong? See, that would be an oxymoron almost. I would say, how could that possibly be? But that's what Paul then wants to press us into in this particular text. So then we got to understand what is the purpose of our weakness. Okay? Let's start out with weakness creates meekness. Okay? Yeah, I'm waiting for rhyme. Yeah, I wanted to rhyme a little bit. I was practicing that. But we're going to first start with how weakness creates meekness. Okay, look at verse 7. Now, watch the text and how it unfolds here and what Paul does. Paul starts out and he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself. I'm going to stop right there. Paul talks about this revelation. This revelation that Paul had this revelation that he went to the third heaven. And if you look at it, verses 1 through 5 is where it unfolds. So if you look at verses 1 through 5 in this particular text, Paul begins to talk about the revelation that he had with God. Paul says, what I did was, I don't know whether I was in my body or out of my body, but Paul says, all I know is that God elevated me to the point to where I went to the third heaven. And Paul says, when I was there in the third heaven, let me give you an idea of what we'd understand as the third heaven. Paul would have said the sky would have been the first heaven, space would have been the second heaven, and where God resided would have been the third heaven. So Paul is saying in 1 through 5, when I had the opportunity, God had shown me some things that only God has revealed to me. And when God brought me there, whether I was in the body or not, I don't know. Paul says, when God brought me there, all of a sudden I heard things and I was told things that only God could have revealed. And he said, because of this, now Paul then gets to verse 7, and he said, because of the revelation that God has poured into me and bringing me to the third heaven where no one else had seen, Paul said, you know what? I could come back and actually I could be prideful about all of this that has happened in my life. But he's saying, because of this reason that I went to this revelation, he said, God then has what he says in verse 7. He says, God then, for this reason, keeps me from exalting myself. God is trying to keep me from having pride. Now I'm going, how is it that God takes you to the third heaven, Paul, and then from that keeps you from exalting pride? God says, because I've let you see all these things and how they're working, he says, I've got to somehow keep you humble and meek so that you don't exalt yourself among everybody else. Paul says, now look, I could talk about how things have been going on for my life, but I could be prideful, but I'm telling you, the reason God exalted me was to keep me humble. He said, that's the reason. That's what the text said. He said, the reason I was able to see these revelations, the reason I was able to be exalted is because God wanted to use those things in order to keep me in a place that I don't become. Listen, I don't become prideful. He said, I've been trying to keep you from pride. See, here's the thing. Pride is a lot of times at the bottom of every mistake. A lot of times at the bottom of every mistake. We become arrogant. We think we've arrived. We think we've achieved something. And see, we begin to step a little higher and our knees go up. And then all of a sudden a mistake happens. Because it becomes at the center and the backdrop typically of most mistakes. And so Paul then comes and he said, I've been elevated. I could step high. I really could. But God has done this for the purpose of keeping me humble. Now listen, he's not finished. Now he goes on and he said, now God, you know, my weakness, now it's created this meekness or humility within me. So then Paul says, now after that Paul says, look, he says, to keep me from it, he said, that was given to me now, this thorn. He says, now what was given unto me was this thorn in the flesh. Now, some people would say that this thorn that Paul had was a moral flaw, that there was a morality problem with Paul. But if you look at the text, it doesn't hold the weight that it should to be able to explain that. So it's obviously not a morality flaw. But then others say, well, the problem with this thorn is a thorn of people. Oh, you don't know that people can be a thorn in your flesh. So Paul was saying, well, it could possibly be people that were the thorn in his flesh. People have been, against Paul, and they didn't want Paul to do certain things. And so he was saying these people could have been the thorn that was in Paul's flesh. But more than likely that was probably not the context, even though people can be a thorn in your flesh. You guys know that because you got some people that you probably said, I wish I could just I could take them out. They gotta get rid of them. But Paul says the thorn then is probably related to Galatians 4. Because in Galatians 4:15, Paul talks about my eyes were not able to see. And what happened when I went to meet the Galatians, he says what they did was they were willing to pluck out their own eyes and give them to me so that I could be able to see. So then we would conclude that probably the thorn had to do with a physical ailment that Paul had, which would be his sight. Now, when people would see Paul and he would come and he could barely see, and he was going, hey, can you help me move around? I can barely see you. They would say, if this is what the gospel produces, someone like you, Paul, in this weakness, I don't want any parts of it. And you see? Paul is saying, what I have now is a thorn in my side, even though I've been to the third heaven, and I could be prideful. God has put something in my side so that then I can now have a weakness when I present myself in front of people, and people look at me, they say, I don't want anything to do with that gospel that you have. Because if this is what it produces, Paul, why would I want this thorn, which is a messenger of Satan, to come and bother me? People were saying, I don't want to have anything to do with the gospel, Paul. Paul says, but then Paul goes, here, this thorn that is here for me. Listen to it. What is the thorn that you have? What is the thorn that God has placed in you? Now, we can turn and be so arrogant and say, I don't have a thorn. Now, some of us might even say that. Would not even display a thorn. But do you understand, if you don't have a thorn, then you don't have a weakness and you don't have a platform in which God can use to elevate you. You don't have anything that God could use and prop you up on it and say, look at how I work, because I'm working regardless of their thorn. So to have the thorn, you would say, I don't want it. I want to be successful. Yes, that's great. That's wonderful that we want those things. But to have the thorn means that God is really working within you. So you can say, well, I don't want a thorn. If I see what it produces in you, Paul, why would I want that thorn? But the thorn is what brings out the weakness, and then it allows us to pursue a higher calling with God. Now he says, Paul says, I got this thorn in my flesh. And this thorn has created within me a humility, a weakness that God has brought about, which is a messenger from Satan that God has allowed. And because of this weakness, Paul is saying, listen, God has brought it for the specific purpose. And what does he say at the end of the verse? From exalting myself. Wait a minute. Paul just told us twice. Paul says, I've got to be kept from pride two different ways. One, that I've seen the revelation of Christ, and it's been laid out before me, and I could be prideful. Paul says, I can't be exalted. Paul says, I have to be humbled for that. And number two is that I have this thorn that's been placed in my side, which is a messenger from Satan, a condition that God has given me. And because of that, God says, I got to keep you from exalting yourself. Two conditions that Paul has, and Paul both says both conditions are the very purpose of creating with him these weaknesses, of creating the meekness and humility that he needs. So now I would say, so if you don't have a thorn, if you don't have something that is creating this torment, he says he's been tormented from this. He says he's been slapped around, beat up. He says I've been slapped around, beat up, mistreated because of this thorn that happens to be in the side of me. He said, but the whole reason is so that God would be able to utilize me and to bring me to the point of humility. See, and we tend to think that God would put the thorn there in our side because we're sinning. No. Paul is saying the very opposite. Paul is saying the reason God placed the thorn was to keep me from sinning. Oh, that's hard, but it's true. It's true. See, we tend to think, well, I got this thorn. It's because I sin. No. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, I've got a weakness here, but God has put it there. See, and God put it there for the very purpose to keep me from sinning. I'm going to flush that out here in a minute. You're going to see it come to fruition. So we can see the thorn, and what we tend to do is we despise the thorn. Why do I have to have this thorn? Why do I have to have a weakness like this? We'll despise it, saying it's no good. But in actuality, it is for your good. So we look at the thorn and say, God has given me the thorn because I'm not useful. No. God has given you the thorn to make you useful. It is the weaknesses that God needs in order to make you useful. So Paul is saying, look, I got this thorn. I've been elevated to the third heaven. I've seen the revelations of God, and he said, it's there for the purpose of keeping me meek and humble. And he said, God has put a thorn in my side. I have limitations that when I approach people with the gospel and tell them about Christ, I can barely read. But guess what? God says that's the weakness I need in you, Paul. Because with that weakness, Paul, he says that keeps you from exalting yourself. What about, Paul? About the revelation you've seen in the third heaven. Oh, yeah. And he said, Paul, this weakness, this thorn, that's the thing I'm going to allow you to stand on and be elevated. See, so we act like, we can say, I don't have any weakness. Okay, all right. God ain't using you. You got nothing for God to work with. See, those who come and say, yeah, I got some problem, God can work with them. See, he can work with them. But those who got it all together, God can't work with you. Paul said, it's my weakness, the fact that I don't have it all together. This is why God is using me. So if that's what Paul is saying, why don't we stand and say, nothing's wrong with me? No. We have problems. That's the problem. We have them. And he's saying with those problems that we have, this reason, he says, I've had a messenger from Satan. Is there to torment me, to cause problems in my life? And see, we can't necessarily understand what people go through until we've been through it ourselves. It's hard for us. We look at them and say, you shouldn't be weak. What's wrong with you? Until you go through it. Then all of a sudden, you are, oh, Lord, I understand. Mm-hmm. See, because I had to call and apologize to my mom. I had children. When I had them, I can do this, Mama. You don't know. Yeah, She said, keep trying. She says, keep on living is what she would tell me. That's how she just always say, keep on living. And I had to call and apologize to my mother and say, I'm sorry, Mama. You know why I'm sorry, Mama? Because I didn't have to go through what you went through. I'm sorry for the way I acted. Sorry for the way I behaved. Sorry for the words I said. Sorry for everything I did. You know why, Mama? Because I got children now. And I see the way they do, Mama. They're doing me like they did you, Mama. I did you. And I didn't understand till I had to go. We don't understand, a lot of times we don't understand till we got to go through it. And then when we go through it, all of a sudden, yeah, we understand. And we go to somebody, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for how I acted. I've never had to sit in that seat. And when I find you have to sit in that seat, things are a little bit different. Paul says my weakness, what it has done, is created some meekness within me. But listen, he says also my weakness has created maturity. Look what he says in the next verse. Paul says in the next verse, he says, right now, he says, concerning this, he says, what I've done is I've implored. He says, what I've done is I've implored the Lord. I've implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. Now here's how it creates a maturity within us. See, this thorn that Paul had, it remained in him for 14 years. So it wasn't something that was just simply overnight. It was 14 years. 14 years in which this thorn remained in his side. 14 years that has kept him or what he felt like from his higher purpose. 14 years of nagging and 14 years of discouragement. This thorn was in Paul's side for 14 years. And then this thorn, see, what it did was it drove Paul to prayer. Yeah. Now here's the maturity part. See, when you have a weakness and a thorn in your side like Paul had, it remained 14 years. And what Paul said happened to him, he says, concerning the thorn that I had, the weakness that I have, that has brought about humility, it has drawn me into the position of prayer. It has pushed me deeper into God. Paul says, I was praying passionately, and then he says, not only that, I was praying on my knees in passionate prayer constantly before God because I didn't know when God would remove it. And since the moment I have it, I've been in prayer with God consistently. We have to understand, prayer is not some type of vending machine. It's not. It's not something where you just simply put it in and you just pull out what you want. It's not that way. Prayer is really about God giving me what I would want if I knew what he wants and what he knows. See, so prayer is when you enter in, trying to find out what God knows, so that then you would know what to pray for in your life. It's not you coming to God telling God, it's you trying to find out what God knows. Because if I know what you know, God, then I know how to pray. So then if you want to know what God knows, then this is why it's imperative that you spend time in the Word of God, because this is what God knows. And see, when you know what he knows, then it orchestrates your prayer. See, that's what prayer means, to submissively submit to the will of God. When I was in Austin, I had a chance to meet Max Lucado. Max Lucado was a famous writer. I had a chance to meet him. Matter of fact, I told him, look, man, I want to take a picture with you. I want to take a picture. I just want to take a picture. Took a picture with him. I said, man, I love your writings. I read them all the time. And I told him, when I said, you know, the snow cone man was always good. The snow cone. Max Lucado in one of his books talks about the snow cone man. He says in the book, he says the daughter wanted him to, her daddy to become a snow cone salesman. Said, Daddy, it would be great if you would become a snow cone salesman. And he says, you know, I think God is calling me to be a pastor. And she said, Daddy, it'd be much better if you'd be a snow cone salesman. Because if you're a snow cone salesman, the kids would come around the house. Everybody would love to see you when you show up. Daddy, it would be much better to be a snow cone salesman. And he says, no, baby. He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pastor and administer the gospel. See, for her, though, because that's all she knew, that was what she wanted. Sometimes we cut ourselves short for what God has for us, because that's all we see. And that's all we want. We end up being a snow cone salesman when God has a lot more for us. We end up stopping short because our prayers are short. We don't know what to pray for and how to pray because we don't understand what God wants for us. And if you understand what God wants for you, then you might end up being far more than a snow cone salesman. Far more. Paul says, what I did was with my weakness that came in my life. Paul says, it was created in me humility and meekness. And he said it created in me a passion of maturity. It was growing me. Look what else he says. He says, weakness creates meekness. Weakness creates maturity. But look at this. Weakness creates manifestation. This is the good stuff. See, he gets right here in verse 10. He says right in verse 9, and he said to me, Paul says, he gave me an answer. Says, through my prayers that I've been praying for over 14 years about this thorn that has created in me a weakness, even though I couldn't be powerful because of the revelations I've seen. Paul says, I get to verse 9. Paul says, right here, he says, he answers my prayer and he tells me, my grace, is sufficient for you. He says, and right here, and for power then is perfected in weakness. That's the good stuff. That's the shouting stuff right there. See, he tells them right here, my grace is sufficient for you. Okay. We're not grabbing that. Okay. We're going to grab this. Grace is beyond unmerited favor. See, that's what we say. Grace is God's unmerited favor that God pours out upon us. Yes, that's great. But it's also his unlimited power. So it's beyond simply unmerited favor, but also his unlimited power. So that means that when God pours out his grace upon you, he pours out his favor that is unmerited. Even though you're not warranted for it, God still pours it out on you. And when it comes, you have access to now unlimited power. So then he tells him, he says, Paul, what I'm going to do for you, Paul, I'm not going to remove the thorn, but what I'm going to pour in you is my unmerited favor, which is going to give you unlimited power. See? And he said, when these things two occur, they come together. And he says, at this point, that's going to be what the very thing that props you up. That's going to be the very thing that makes you stand. That's going to be the very tent that caps over your life. He said, that's the very thing that's going to be sufficient for you. And then he says, what's going to happen is, when my tent is captured over you, the power of God is going to then be manifested through the weaknesses that you have. He said, Paul, I'm going to give you a better deal. I'm not going to take out the weakness. No. I'm going to take the weakness that you have, Paul, and I'm going to submit my power of grace through you, and then make God be revealed, and everybody's going to look at you, Paul, and when they see you, they're not going to see the weakness. No, they're going to see the power of God working through you. And when they do, you, Paul, I'm going to take you and I'm going to send you on journeys. I'm going to let you write over half the books of the New Testament. I'm going to use you, Paul, in ways that only they could say that was only God doing that. Yeah. He says, I'm going to show them our grace is on the scene. See, what happens is, this is why you want the weakness. Because our competency that we have hides the power of God. See, when we have our own competency, and that's what we stand on, then what that does is suppresses God's power. And it hides it. So then God's power is not being manifested, which is the grace that he sent, which is the unmerited favor and unlimited power of God. He said, so your competency, yeah, they're great. But don't you understand that hides the magnificent power and grace of God? It suppresses all that God can do. He was saying, listen, he was saying, Paul, he said, what you want is you want this weakness because it dramatizes the power of God. It makes it more elevated. Because when people see the weakness in you, they got to say, your weakness doesn't match your resume. See, your resume is beyond what you're showing. See, your resume shows all of these things, but when we look at you, it don't match. And when they don't match, then all you got, hey, it's the grace of God. Then you know grace is on the scene. See? That's when grace has shown himself. When your education don't match your accomplishments. Your sickness doesn't match what you're doing. See, that's knowing right there, that's the grace of God. Your qualifications don't match this beautiful thing of accomplishments you've done. Then you know grace is on the scene. And he was telling them, he said, this is how, Paul, I'm giving you a better answer. I'm letting you have grace on the scene. I said, yeah. The weakness creates this manifestation of God. I said, man, that's great. I said, man, wouldn't it be great that God continues to manifest himself clearly in all of us? He says, I've been to the third heaven, but yet God used to humble me. I've had a thorn in my side, but God used that to humble me. And what it did was it drove me to the point of prayer. Passionately, persistently submitting and ready to give unto the will of God. I want to be more than a snow cone salesman, God. Beyond what my child sees. And with that, God says, listen, Paul, your answer is that grace is on the scene. It's manifested in you by unmerited favor and unlimited power. And when it shows up, he says that right there shows that it works through the weaknesses of individuals. So yeah, our culture celebrates strength and successes, but God celebrates weaknesses. That's what God, and then Paul turns, he said, that's when I'm glad, Paul says, now I'm glad, Paul says, he says, now I'm happy to find out that God magnified himself through my weakness. So you know the story. You know the story. Christ came. When he came in weakness. Came as a little baby in weakness. He was reared in weakness. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane in weakness. There he prayed passionately and persistently in weakness. There he was arrested in the garden in weakness. He was beaten in weakness. Nailed in weakness. All of these things were done in weakness. Buried in weakness. Stayed in the tomb in weakness. But they said on Sunday morning, they said he got up. It was no longer weakness. Weakness was gone. That had surpassed. He got up with power. He got up with strength. And that is what we have access to. He left weakness in the grave. All power and all strength is available to you now. Through the power of God. The purpose of my weakness, so that God's power will be seen. If you believe it, say amen.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the sermon and encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, you will receive even more encouraging words from Pastor Tim. Remember, in addition to the videos, with a simple registration, you can receive the Life Notes. Pastor's outline and scripture references for his sermons will come directly to your inbox each week. Thank you again for watching. You are always invited to attend our morning worship services every Sunday morning starting at 10 a.m. Bible studies are Wednesday evenings starting at 6:30. You've been listening to Pastor Timothy Jones of Rock Bridge Church, Allen, Texas, where we follow the Go MC mission: God, others, ministry, and community.